Hey, Jameson Mitchell here, and in this video I'm going to be doing a line of 5 Lenormand reading, but before I get into the reading itself, I need to do a little bit of background, a little bit of setup. So what happened recently is I just completed my Grand Tableau series on my friend Howard and his career or his self-employment venture, becoming an Akashic Records consultant. And so a new viewer who came upon my videos, she sent me a message. She's been watching them and she's been enjoying them, and she asked me the question about possibly doing a line of 5 or a Grand Tableau on a love relationship oriented type question. So I kind of thought about that, and I thought, well, that's different, because in my personal practice, while those of you who may be card readers know that the traditional subjects that all card readers talk about are, love, money, and career, I tend to have a majority of my clients wanting to talk about career, self-employment, and work. So usually a lot of my clients are people who are already self-employed or people who are making the transition from being employees to becoming self-employed. And so that just became my thing. That is my thing. Now, I do also have lots of clients who, sometimes in the course of that will ask about a relationship, but the majority of people tend to be more work-oriented or more career-oriented. Then the love relationship is like a close second. So I thought about that, and I thought, oh, that would be interesting, because I hadn't really done any videos like that. So I always go to the cards first before I embark on something new, just to kind of see what the cards want to offer me. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing a reading that I did, and it started off one way and it shifted into another. So it started off where I was exploring the idea of, like, what do I need to know about presenting love relation type Lenormand readings in my videos. And so I was reading the cards in that regard, and then I just saw this relationship scenario unfold right before my eyes. There was a significant card in the reading that kind of just pointed me in that direction. So I'm going to be presenting, looking at it from that standpoint as well. So that's my intro, and so now we're going to go into the cards. You're going to see the line of 5. I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of, my initial question, and then I'm going to show you the shift and take it from there. So let's get to the cards. So here we have the line of 5. These were the cards that showed up in my reading. They're face down because I want to elaborate on my process just a little bit and show you how I started looking at the cards one way, and then the shift happened that allowed me to look at it in a way that I could read it as a possible relationship scenario. So before I get into the actual cards, the deck that I used for this reading is the Under the Roses Lenormand, and here's the box. It is created by Kendra Hurteau and Katrina Hill, and this was actually my very first Lenormand, so it has some significance and personal meaning to me. So again, this is the Under the Roses Lenormand. And so when I started this reading, I was looking at, what did the cards want to inform me about the idea of doing relationship-oriented Lenormand readings on my YouTube channel. So everybody who has seen my line of 5 readings before knows that I always start with the middle card, because the middle card for me represents the focus or the central issue. So we had here the grave, which is in traditional Lenormand known as the coffin. So I first looked at this card and I thought, okay, well, it's a challenging card. It can be an indication of something coming to an end. So I thought, okay, is this ending before it begins? And also, too, it can represent limitation or restriction. So I went with that more so than the idea of something ending. So for me, this grave represents limitation or restriction, which means that there could be limited interest, or it's only going to be restricted to a certain number of people, and that would be the people who are into, the relationship-oriented, love-oriented types of questions and readings. So I thought that. So then what I usually do is I look at the other cards around to kind of inform me more of what the central card is. So going from left to right, I turn the cards over. So I looked at the first card, which was the mountain, and I'm like, okay, well, that's a challenge, an obstacle, you know, something of that nature. So it would be saying, too, that the reason why I'm asking the question is because, you know, a challenge has been posed. You know, somebody did put it to me, to ask me to do these types of readings, so that did make sense. Then the next card was the bouquet, and so here we go. So then I immediately looked at the pairing of mountain and bouquet and saw a surprise challenge, or a challenge that came as a surprise, you know, that kind of energy. So, and it was a surprise because it was something that I wasn't expecting. So it was a surprise challenge, or a challenge that becomes inviting, because after I got the message on my community page, I started thinking about it, and it kind of really excited me. So I thought about that. So that was that energy made sense. And so here on the other side of grave, we had the owls, and the owls is also known as the birds. And so I thought, well, this is interesting because the owls represents communication and conversation, something being spoken, but it also represents a partnership. But in this day and age, the birds or the owls for me can represent like tweeting. So I always think of like social media, and YouTube is a form of social media. You form relationships and partnerships with people online. So I saw that kind of energy. And so, but also too, going with the topic, I thought this is very appropriate because the topic was about relationships generally speaking. And so I thought, well, that was cool that the owl showed up in the line. So then the last card was the gentleman. And so when I first looked at it, typically the gentleman can represent a man who's significant to the situation if it's not the person asking the question. So I'm male, but in this particular deck, this is not my card. So I knew when I first laid it down that this gentleman wasn't me. So it could represent another man significant to the situation. But here's what I know to be true in terms of my channel and my audience. The number of people who have subscribed to my channel and who watch my videos and who comment on my videos are women. So the gentleman here is kind of like, it struck me because it really stands out. And here's the reason why I know it's not me. In this particular deck, there are two gentleman cards. And I pre-selected the one that's always going to be me, and you'll know why when I show it to you. So this is the gentleman that actually represents me. I'm putting it over here next to the birds. So if you see me in my little intros, you know that I am African American. And so when I first got this deck, actually this is the reason why I got this deck, is because the gentleman in this deck, there's, you know, you can have your choice of races or ethnicities or cultures based on your own personal preference or choice. And so I chose the African American gentleman because he represents me. He's reflective of me. And so when I noticed the other gentleman in the line, I knew immediately that it wasn't me. And so you may be wondering, well, why do you do that? Why do you have two gentleman cards in your deck if you know one is you and you're asking a question about you? That's a good question. The reason why is because a lot of my readings in my private practice cater to same-sex couples. So I always like to have the extra gentleman and the extra lady in the deck. So that is my personal reason for having it in there, and I tend to leave it in there and not take it out. So, but again, going back to, so when I looked at the gentleman, I thought, okay, well, and interestingly enough, if you notice that the gentleman is not facing all the other cards. So it could be saying too, like, you know, if there is going to be a limitation or a restriction, it may be limited to an audience of women because the man is not facing the rest of the cards. He's kind of like off looking somewhere where we can't see because there's no other card coming after him. So I looked at that and I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And then as I was looking at the cards, it kind of shifted all of a sudden. And for those of you who may read cards yourselves, if you've been reading for any long period of time, you know that sometimes, this may sound a little crazy, but you know sometimes the cards tend to speak to you. And so I was looking at the line and I could see the bouquet going, surprise, and then all of a sudden I could just see this relationship scenario just come into my mind. So I kind of went with it. So we're going to be talking about the shift if you're going to be looking at it as a relationship issue or concern. So having said that, the central card being the grave could be talking about something ending, something that's limited or restricted. So we could just say that if this was a relationship-oriented situation that's being brought to us, we could be looking at the grave as saying that the relationship has come to some kind of end. And then what I do with my line of 5 is I look at the cards that are immediately flanking the central card. So here we have the bouquet and we have the owls as a pair. And so for me, I looked at it. So 2 issues that could have been leading to or connected to the reason why the relationship ended was, on the one side here we had the bouquet, and for me the bouquet can be about appreciation. Some of the other meanings are like gift, surprise, invitation, but I tend to look at it as a form of appreciation because in relationships we tend to give the gift of flowers, to show our appreciation. So that's where I get the meaning of appreciation from. So appreciation on one side, and then here with the owls, I said that this could be a relationship, so that again really fits the scenario. But the owls can also be about communication. So it could be like on one side, part of the challenge or the problem was issues dealing with appreciation, being appreciated, and then the other one on this side was conversation or communication issues. So I'm seeing that. So the pair could be read as appreciation in a partnership. So that's how I looked at that. So that's one way of getting more detail about maybe why the relationship ended, or what was its limitations or restrictions, why it wasn't working, why it didn't go anywhere. So then the next thing we can do is we can look at the outer card. So we have the mountain on the one side. So I touched on the mountain being a challenge or a block or an obstacle. And then the man here on the other side of the line would just be representative of the man in the partnership, let's say. So it could be, since the man is not facing the mountain, I tend to look at cards like that as like, that's his past, that's behind him. So it could be like past blocks of the man, or that the man was remote or distant, going with the mountain. I sometimes see the mountain as remote, something being remote or distant in the past. Either way, however you want to look at it, because he's not facing that way, it could have been like how he may have operated in the relationship in the past. So I saw that. Then the next thing is I looked at the pairing of mountain and bouquet, because you can sometimes look at this as, maybe issues from the past that led up to the grave or the ending or the limitation or the restriction of the relationship. So mountain and bouquet, again, going with what I had initially said when I was reading it for myself, could be a surprise challenge or a surprise obstacle, or a challenge with appreciation, if that was one of the 2 factors in the relationship that led to its demise. Then it could be, again, saying that there was a challenge with that. And so it's reinforcing this idea that that was an issue. And then on the other side, we have owls and gentlemen. And so that could have been something, in the future, or that happened immediately after the ending of the relationship. And so here we have, frustration, because I tend to look at the owls from an emotional standpoint as frustration, as sorrow, as, nervous, anxiety, things like that. So it could be frustration with the man. It could also be frustration with the partnership, going, if you read the cards twice, you could read the owls twice as frustration and then partnership. So frustration with the partnership for the man, and maybe that's why it ended, because it was frustrating for him. Or frustration in the partnership with the man. So let's say, either way, could be, if reading this for a woman and the man's not present, then it could be like she was frustrated with him in the relationship, or that he was frustrated with her and that was why he chose to leave. So, but I'm also seeing like frustration with the communication, possibly, in the partnership or the relationship with the man. So there are several factors of looking at that pairing. And then what I do is I tend to look at the cards that are connected to the central card. So on the one side we have bouquet and grave, that makes a pair. And then here it reinforces the idea of the appreciation factor by saying some limited appreciation, or restricted appreciation, or no appreciation, because sometimes the grave can mean no. If you're doing like a yes-no question and the grave comes up, it can sometimes mean no. So no appreciation, or that appreciation comes to an end. You know, if you read this card first and follows this. Those are some possibilities there, but it reinforces the idea that appreciation was an issue. And then we can go with the idea here of connecting grave and owls. And then that would be a limitation of communication. Also reinforces the idea of the ending of a partnership, end of the discussion, like maybe somebody wanted to try and talk about it and the other person said no. You know, this is the end, this is the final discussion, there's nothing else to say. That kind of energy. The end of a frustrating partnership, going with the idea that owls can be frustration and partnership. And then an ending that leads to sorrow. So those are some possibilities with that pairing there. And then we don't just have to do the inner cards, we could do the outer cards with the center card. So if we do that, then we have mountain and we have grave. And then that becomes a challenge, comes to an end. And then sometimes for me, the mountain can represent a delay. I look at this as delay and postponement. Like for me, in my own personal experience, when the mountain comes up in my own personal readings, I tend to read it as procrastination, because usually on that day I put something off. So if we look at it like that, and then the grave being the ending, you know, that expression like postponing the inevitable. So I saw that. So it's like at the beginning they could see that there was going to be a challenge in a relationship, but they just kept putting it off and delaying the inevitable, and then here is the inevitable. It was like, in a way, it's like these cards are saying it was bound to happen. It just was just going to be a matter of time. So I saw that as a possibility. And then here we have the grave and the gentleman. And so that could just be read as the ending with the man, or ending for the man. It can also be the idea here that the man is closed off, or the man is shut down. If you go with the idea that the coffin is technically it's a box, and so it's a closed off space, and you know, it has a lid so it can be shut. So it could just be like part of it. And if you notice, part that could be playing into the communication issues, like maybe the man wasn't a communicator, or he didn't talk because he maybe couldn't express his feelings because he was closed off or he was shut down. So that is a possibility there. So I saw that. And so after I do all the pairings, then, you know, I trying to come up with a kind of summary or a summation. And so this is how I would read the line. And it's just one possibility. If you're watching this and you see something else, you know, go with that. Because I know a lot of the people who watch my videos are also embarking on their Lenormand journey themselves. They may be just starting out, or they may have been reading for a short period of time. And so we all know that every reader reads differently, and so each one of us is going to see something different. So this is what jumped out at me. So I read the line going from left to right as the challenge with the mountain of being appreciated with the bouquet ends with the grave, a partnership with the owls, with the man. So I'm going to say that again. So it's the challenge of being appreciated ends the partnership with the man. Now it could also be, that's one way of looking at it. We could also say the challenge of being appreciated ends a partnership for the man. So it could be like, depending on how we look at it. if we look at it from the woman's perspective, she could end it with the man. If we look at it from the man's perspective, he was the one who did it, and he did it for himself. So that's just one word can change the perspective of the situation. So that is the summation. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into looking at the playing cards. And so what did the playing cards have to offer in terms of additional detail? And so now turning our attention to the playing cards, we have, for the mountain, we have the 8 of clubs. For the bouquet, we have the Queen of Spades. For the grave, we have the 9 of diamonds. For the owls, we have the 7 of diamonds. And then for the gentleman, we have the Ace of hearts. So we could look at this and see that the bouquet can be a stand-in for a woman because it's a queen. And here the bouquet could be a woman who's beautiful, a woman who's attractive, a woman who's creative, and it could be saying too that the woman had the issue, since it's attached to this card, with the appreciation. So I'm just throwing that in there because it is a face card. So what I do with the dynamics is I look at the first 2 playing cards and add those up as a total because they're going to show us one side of the issue, keeping with the grave being the issue, as to why the relationship ended, maybe adding another element to it that we didn't see in the initial cards. So we have an 8, and then the queen for me is valued at 12. So 8 and 12 is 20. And then the 20th card in the deck is the garden. So my first immediate impression of the garden was it can represent other people. So it could be that other people factored into the relationship coming to an end. So maybe people offering their advice, going with the idea here, the owls being a communication card. Sometimes the owls can represent like gossip and rumor and speculation. So it could be like maybe one party in the relationship was gossiping or talking about the relationship with other people, and then these other people were weighing in, giving their advice, that kind of energy, and maybe speculating on whether the relationship was going to succeed or not. So there could be that kind of energy. The owls can sometimes represent like idle chatter or superficial kind of conversation, nothing really deep. So it could be like that too. So I'm seeing that as one side. The other side with the garden could be like somebody being very social, somebody being very public, that kind of energy. So it could be like, the idea of just like going out all the time or being around other people, that kind of energy. So that's one side of that. Now, then the other side of the issue, if we look at the 7 and then the ace being 1, 7 and 1 is 8. And so here we have the grave. And so now we have the grave in the line. So I'm going to move the card over on this side. So the grave, again, would just reinforce the idea of somebody, limitation, restriction, somebody being closed off, somebody being shut down. And so if you look at that, it forms an interesting dichotomy here. I'm going to bring these cards back down so they're closer to each other now and stay in the shot. So here on one side, we have maybe somebody who's very social, very public, likes to hang out with people, in this case, maybe somebody who's very extroverted, that kind of energy, or, always wants to be out, out and about, that kind of energy. And here we have the grave, we have total opposite. Somebody who maybe likes to stay in, somebody who is very limited and restricted to the amount of people that they have around, that kind of energy. So I just saw this as somebody who's very public and maybe somebody who's very private, to the point where they're almost like a shut-in, that kind of energy. So I thought that was a very interesting dynamic to have with that. So it could also be somebody who's very expressive, shares their feelings. If we go with the communication being an issue, somebody who shares their feelings, is just very open, and then the other person who's very closed off. So I'm seeing that as energy of the possible dynamics of this was here. Okay, so put that back. And then the final thing I do with the playing cards is I add them all across. So here we have 8 with the mountain, 12 with the bouquet, 9 with the grave, 7 with the owls, and 1 with the gentleman. So the total is 37. So the way I usually approach that is any number over 36, I usually take the digits and add them together. And here we have 3 plus 7, so that's 10. And then the 10th card in the deck is the sickle. It's also known as the scythe. So for me, this can represent disconnection. When we're talking about relationships, I always see this as disconnection. It can represent a break, a split, something being severed, something being cut. So I'm just seeing, that kind of energy, and reinforces actually the grave. If the relationship ended, then that would make sense with there being, the split or the break, ending the relationship. But again, it goes with the idea of not being connected. And so that would bring it back to the owls. Possibly a disconnection is a lack of communication, possibly that being tied to that. And then the last thing about the sickle here is that it can be something that's painful and something that's hurting. And so then that would make sense with the owls being about sorrow. So of course, if the person is in pain or they're hurt, then they're also expressing sorrow. So I'm seeing that. And then the last thing, of course, the sickle is also a card about elimination. So same kind of energy. So it just reinforces the idea that the relationship is over, and that at least one party involved is in pain about it. But here's the truth. Even no matter how a relationship ends, there is going to be a little bit of pain and hurt on both sides. That's just how I look at it. So the last thing we can do is we can look at the numbers, because I always say this in all my Lenormand videos, is that for me, Lenormand works on 3 facets. It has the central image and the keywords that are attached to that. Then the playing card offers another facet of information, and then the numerical value of the card itself. So we're going to next take a look at the numerical value to see what final piece of advice is going to be offered here. And now taking a look at the numbers on the cards for the final piece of advice we could have regarding this relationship issue. We have 21 for the mountain, 9 for the bouquet, 8 for the grave, 12 for the owls, and 28 for the gentleman. And that gives us a total of 78. Again, being over 36, I'm going to take 7 and 8, add them together, and that's 15. And the 15th card in the deck is the bear. So I'm going to put the bear in the middle. And for me, my keywords for the bear tend to be more business oriented. I tend to look at the bear as the boss. So for me, it represents somebody who is in a managerial position, somebody who's a supervisor, somebody who has some authority or some influence. Now, other words for the bear for me are like power and strength and force. So it could be that, going with that as my take on it, it could be that there were power or control issues in the relationship that kind of led up to the end of it. It could be like, when I say that, I'm always thinking about like that expression of you're not the boss of me, or somebody wanting to be bossy and controlling that way. So I'm getting that kind of energy or that kind of vibe with it. So there were like power or control issues. Now, there are some people who read the bear as like mother energy. So you think about like mama bear, protecting her cubs, that kind of energy. So going with that as a possibility, then I would think that if the relationship came to an end, it could be more like mothering energy taken to the nth degree, and then it becomes very smothering. The idea of like, a dominant force, somebody who is overprotective, or, that kind of energy, like it just becomes a bit too much. It's like smothering, instead of like mothering kind of energy. So it could be like one party in the relationship felt smothered. And as a result of that, then the last thing I see with the bear is like sometimes it can represent like a weighty issue because it can deal with weight. So I tend to look at it as something being heavy. And so it could just be as a result of all that, the energy of the relationship just got to be too heavy, And so those were the things that led up to the relationship coming to an end. So again, I'm seeing it as maybe, power issues, control issues, being smothered, and the energy of it just feeling really, really heavy. So that would be how I would look at that scenario. So this brings looking at this situation from a love or relationship perspective to a close. As I sign off, I'm just going to say that I hope that the person who sent in the request, I hope if you watch this, and everyone else too who comes upon it, I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it informative. And I will, because it's kind of got me excited now, I will be presenting more love relationship scenarios and seeing what the Lenormand has to say. I already have an idea for another line of 5 and possibly doing this from a perspective of doing a grand tableau like I did with my friend Howard and his work situation. I'm figuring that maybe I could do one from a love relationship perspective. So again, this is James Himm Mitchell. I'm signing off. I want to thank you for sharing the space with me. And until our next video together, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day. And until we get together again in the future, take care.